In 2014, Russian forces invaded and illegally annexed Crimea. 11 years later, the United States says we're prepared to recognize that as Russian territory, which is a pretty big departure from previous policy and the rest of the world, for what it's worth. This is according to a Bloomberg article yesterday where they say the U.S. is prepared to recognize Russian control of Crimea as part of a broader peace agreement between Moscow and Kyiv. And look, my take on this, and we'll get into this further later in the video, it looks like we're just ready to strike some deal for the sake of striking a deal, even if it doesn't actually lead to any sort of long-term peace. We mentioned in yesterday's video, Secretary Rubio saying time is up. We need like days or weeks. We got to get there or we're going to walk away. And we have more reporting today saying that President Trump is just fed up with this. He's tired. He's ready to move on. Now, starting with this recognition of Crimea, if we were to do that, the reason this is such a hot button issue, and we'll get into the history there, the annexation in a moment, but if we recognize Crimea, we would join the likes of Russia, of course, Belarus, North Korea, Afghanistan, Syria, Venezuela, Nicaragua, Sudan, and Cuba. That is who the United States is siding with. Right here. That's not normal. That's not where we've been in the past. The entire world, the entire rest of the world said, you can't do that. Russia, you can't invade territory, have a sham referendum, and all of a sudden say that it's yours. Even China was like, hey, we're going to sit on the sidelines for this one, guys. That's a little much. Now, going back to 2014, the reason this is so controversial is you'll hear people still today, unfortunately, say, well, they wanted to be Russian. Hold on now. So in 2014, Russian forces invaded Crimea, and with boots on the ground, they're like, we should hold a referendum and let the people vote, right? The people's decision. How can we go against that? Well, they didn't give them very many options. The options for the people in Crimea, at Russian gunpoint, mind you, were to join Russia or to go fully independent. It's like, that wasn't what Crimea wanted. You notice on that ballot, there was no option to stay a part of Ukraine as they currently were. So the status quo wasn't even a consideration. People had to choose either fully independent, which nobody wanted, or joining Russia. And by the way, the fully independent vote was largely believed, hey, that just means joining Russia a little bit later or maybe via a different method. Now, if you look at polls in Crimea prior to this vote at gunpoint again, the most we ever saw was 41% saying they were in favor of actually joining Russia, which, you could say that's a big number. And sure, that definitely some mixed opinions in Crimea, but the vote actually held under Russian occupation managed to get 97% in favor of joining Russia. What are the odds? 97% in favor of something. Can you believe that? Is there anything here in the United States we could vote on and get 97% in favor of one thing or the other? No, it's a made-up result. And the entire world saw that for what it was and said, yeah, we can't recognize this. This is ridiculous. But here we are, 11 years later, and the United States says, well, if that can get us to some sort of deal, I guess we'll say that it was okay. Now, going back to the Bloomberg article here, they say the U.S. proposals for a peace deal to end Russia's war against Ukraine would leave the occupied territories under Russian control and ease sanctions against Moscow. U.S. officials told European counterparts during meetings that they aim to secure a full ceasefire in Ukraine within weeks. Washington's proposals include an effective freeze on Russia's war, and Kyiv's aspirations to join NATO would also be off the table. So, a couple key points here. NATO off the table should not be a shock to anybody. That has generally been understood as probably not something that's going to happen in the short term. However, prior to Secretary Hegseth speaking at NATO a few months ago, that was generally believed to be something that we were going to hold close to the chest as part of a negotiating tactic. And then in Brussels, Secretary Hegseth said, yeah, absolutely no, that's not going to happen. So we kind of ceded that territory already. Now, there's some pieces here that just seem like we're ready to give in just to say we're done, if you will. We've got the officials here, or they say the officials told Bloomberg that the U.S. plans, which would require further discussion with Kyiv, would not be a final settlement, and that European allies would not recognize the occupied territories as Russian. Like, what are we doing here? We're giving up all of these bargaining points, right? Ukraine joining NATO now or at some point in the future, which Russia, for what it's worth, is saying they want in writing confirmation that Ukraine will never be in NATO. And we're recognizing Crimea in exchange for, I guess, a temporary ceasefire, and Europe is going to continue doing what they're doing to help Ukraine? Is that what this is? Like, why? What are we doing here? They say the officials told Bloomberg that if Russia does not agree to stop the fighting, the talks would be in vain. What? Really? That's kind of where we are right now. There's been 2 ceasefire proposals on the table, temporary ceasefires, to try to bring about a longer term end to this conflict. And in both cases, Russia said, yeah, those terms, but also we want to layer some more on top. So Russia has not agreed to stop the fighting. It's not clear that the recognition of Crimea would all of a sudden lead to that by any stretch of the imagination. They also say that providing Ukraine with security guarantees to ensure any deal is essential. Also, yes, that has been a red line for Ukraine for a long time now, more so, I would argue, than even taking back some of these occupied territories. They understand that they could take those territories back, but without some sort of security guarantee, this whole thing could just happen again. So a security guarantee has been the top of Ukraine's list for quite a while. Even Secretary Rubio yesterday on the tarmac, coming back from this meeting, said, yeah, it's understandable and it's a real thing. It needs to happen. But who's going to offer that? That's this mix between words and actions. Where is that security guarantee coming from? It's great that people are recognizing that's a necessity here for any sort of long-term peace. There's no indication that we are anywhere near any force, be it the United States, which clearly seems like we're off the table at this point, NATO off the table. This coalition of the willing, the United States has pushed back on it. It doesn't even seem like they're necessarily willing to fight against Russia, if you will, if that comes to blows. But nonetheless, security guarantees need to be a part of this. And this all follows Secretary Rubio's talks yesterday on the tarmac. We played a couple of his clips in yesterday's video where he says, hey, we're done. We've had enough. You could see he's getting frustrated. I think he speaks for President Trump as well. We'll get into that in a minute. But let's play some of Rubio's clips yesterday on the tarmac saying, we got to wrap this up now or we're just going to walk away. We got other things to do. Here we go. Let's give it a listen.
But we're not going to continue to fly all over the world and do meeting after meeting after meeting if no progress is being made. So if they're serious about peace, either side or both, we want to help. If it's not going to happen, then we're just going to move on. We're going to move on to other topics that are equally, if not more important in some ways, to the United States.
And Rubio's not talking about let's make some progress forward. He's talking about this thing's got to get wrapped up in the next couple of days, maybe weeks. And there's no indication that we're anywhere close to that right now. In fact, Axios, Barack Ravid reported just yesterday that Trump is getting frustrated with this entire process, which is something we talked about in yesterday's video, saying, quote, several days before President Trump and members of his administration said publicly that they were prepared to wash their hands of Russia-Ukraine diplomacy, Trump ranted in private about his frustrations that the negotiations were going nowhere. Trump made his frustrations clear a few days earlier in an impromptu conversation about the ceasefire push with several of his top advisors, including Secretary of State Marco Rubio and diplomatic envoy Steve Witkoff. That's where Trump raised the idea that if a deal isn't reached soon, he could simply move on to other foreign policy issues, U.S. officials briefed on the issue said. And personally, my view here is that this has been presented as something where we can just snap our fingers and bring about an end to the war. That we have so much leverage over the entire world that when we say stop the fighting, bring it into this conflict, that people will just do it. And that has not been in the cards probably ever throughout this war. We at different times have had more leverage than we do now, but this is not our decision to make. We don't have the cards, to use the term that was thrown at Zelensky a few months ago. Now, the Russian response at this point has been pretty favorable. They like what they're seeing, to nobody's surprise at all. Dmitry Medvedev yesterday said, quote, American officials have said that if there is no progress in the Ukrainian case, the United States will wash its hands of it wisely, and the European Union should do the same. Then Russia will figure it all out faster. So again, to go back here, we need Russia to agree to this. We're trying to give in to some of Russia's demands in order to get them to agree to it. And we have Medvedev saying, oh, this is awesome. The U.S. is getting ready to walk away. That's good for us. So why would they give in to anything at this point? No indications that Russia is moving at all towards any sort of ceasefire agreement. Now, all might not be lost here. Turning to an article or some posts yesterday from Michael Weiss, the editor at The Insider, he talks about what does this actually look like if the United States walks away. We mentioned this briefly in yesterday's video because there are a couple different paths we could take. Is it we walk away from the ceasefire agreement and decide to, double, triple, quadruple our support of Ukraine to force Russia to the negotiating table, in a month, 6 months down the road? Technically, that's one direction. I think probably unlikely. The other is that we just completely walk away entirely. What exactly do each of those mean? Michael Weiss gets into that, specifically talking about the weapons, the impact on weapons and arms supplies, and then sanctions with Russia. With weapons, he says, quote, it is a near certainty that no additional military aid packages will come from this administration once the Biden-era ones run out. But does that mean that Trump will refuse to sell weapons and ammunition directly or indirectly to Ukraine? Does it mean he will actively slap end-user restrictions on European countries from buying American kit for the express purpose of donating it to Ukraine? You know, so what they're getting at here is if Germany says we would just like to buy more Patriot interceptors, we're going to give those to Ukraine, is the United States going to say no because we're not involved with that anymore? Or are we willing to continue to facilitate those arms shipments so long as we're getting paid by our European allies? Seems like we don't want to, just completely wreck the military-industrial complex. We sell a lot of weapons abroad. It seems like that, to me, that feels like a very Trump thing to do, right? Like, we're going to walk away, but we're still going to make some money from this conflict, if you will. Weiss says, quote, now this government is clearly not above economic own goals, but it'll nonetheless be interesting to see how it sells a new dawn with Russia as the price worth paying for crippling the military-industrial complex. Again, you can love or hate the MIC and the big arms contractors, but they're very powerful. They have a lot of money. They do provide a lot of jobs and a lot of revenue to the federal government, a lot of benefit to the U.S. economy as it sits right now. So just completely shutting down all of those foreign arms sales when they could possibly ramp up does seem a little counterproductive, but, who knows? Then turning over to sanctions, he says, quote, does Trump lift some or most sanctions on Russia in the absence of a peace deal? He might in pursuit of rapprochement, but even here he'll find it difficult to give Putin everything he wants with the stroke of a pen. Some of the toughest sanctions, including those on Gazprom and Gas, no way I'm getting that right, are tied to congressional notification and approval thanks to Biden. Trump would also face some headwinds from Republicans on the Hill who would not be happy with sanctions relief in exchange for nothing. And that's a key point here is, wait, what exactly are we getting out of this? If we just remove all, is it just better terms with Russia? Is that it? How important is that right now? We lose all leverage in any way, shape, or form if we just completely remove all sanctions. And to Weiss's point, there's going to be a lot of pushback on the Hill from Republicans. There's still some pretty hawkish Republicans on the Hill that, push comes to shove, I don't know that they're going to all of a sudden get on board with just walking away and giving Putin everything he wants, which is a far cry from doubling or tripling down military aid to Ukraine. Also, he says Europe gets a vote. And this is something that I think we completely gloss over here in the United States. The mindset that we have the entire say and all of the power in this conflict is not true, has never been true, and is not going to be true going forward. He says SWIFT, which Moscow wanted its agricultural bank reconnected to as a precondition for a ceasefire, is based in Brussels. European Union sanctions legislation is by consent. So far, there has been no indication that the European Union is considering lifting sanctions on Russia, whatever DC says, does, or agrees to. The opposite, in fact, is the case. The European Union has been discussing ways to increase sanctions on Russia in coordination with the United Kingdom. So again, my read of all of this, I like the Weiss breakdown. I'll link his full thread in the description below if you want to read that. My full view of this is it looks like we're just ready to walk away. We want to strike some sort of deal to say we struck a deal. But, one point after another here, we don't have the cards. We don't have the leverage here to really push this forward. We can do things like unilaterally recognizing Crimea as Russian territory. That might make Putin happy for a little bit. It's not going to change the outcome of the war. It's not going to change the direction of why would Russia even stop fighting at that point? So nonetheless, it does look like this is something we're moving towards pretty quickly here. Again, based off some comments from President Trump and Secretary Rubio, it seems like they want to come to some sort of conclusion, some sort of deal in the next couple of days, maybe weeks at the most. So it's going to be worth keeping an eye on. But that's all I got for now. Thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.